Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome to our second installment of the Haitians Book Club. I'm going to hand it on over to Brandon Bird, who is going to get us started.
Thank you, Chelsea, and thank you to everybody for being here. My name is Brandon Bird, and on behalf of my fellow co-conveners of the Haitians Book Club, Chelsea Stieber and Shelby Sinclair, it's my absolute pleasure and honor to welcome everybody to our virtual discussion today on the topic of slavery and freedom. Before we introduce our amazing guests here today, I just wanted to first say a little bit more about our incredible translators, the book club, and also thank a few of our sponsor organizations. So first and foremost, our conversation today is being simultaneously translated into Haitian Creole by two expert translators, Nadine Mondestin and Nadège Cherubin. Thank you, Nadine and Nadège. And please remember, and this is for us and for me mainly. I realize that I may be violating our own recommendation here. Please speak at a slow, moderate pace and speak clearly for our translators. Now, if you would like to access today's conversation in Haitian Creole, please just select interpretation. The interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and just select Haitian Creole, and you will be able to join that language channel. The Haitians' Decolonial History is Jean Casimir's landmark work of theory and history, published first in French in 2018 and in English translated by Laurent Dubois in 2020 with the University of North Carolina Press. And this book club is designed to bring together students and scholars, both inside and outside the academy, to a series of discussions with expert guests about the book and the major themes that Casimir addresses and reconceptualizes. Those are translation, slavery and freedom, sovereignty in the state, and colonialism and decoloniality. Our hope is that this forum will facilitate a robust discussion of this landmark book and also provide a meeting space for people interested in exploring these themes in Africa and its diaspora across a range of geographic, disciplinary, and temporal contexts. To that end, we want to emphasize and highlight the open, dialogic nature of these discussions and to encourage your participation. For those following live today, the chat function is open and we're ready and enthusiastic about taking your questions and your comments. For those following on the YouTube live stream, the comment box is also open for you to ask questions and comment there. For those watching this recording, the comment section on our website remains open for discussion and ongoing engagement with the text and with one another. For those new to the book club, please check out our companion website and sign up for our email list. At any time during today's conversation, you should feel free to tweet using the hashtag The Haitians Book Club to share quotes from the text, gems from our speakers, or thoughts that you're having about the discussion. Now, please also mark your calendars for our next session of the book club in October, Friday, October 15th, to be specific, for a discussion of sovereignty in the state with Chelsea Kivlin and Nathalie Pierre. Same time, same place, same sponsors as well. With that, I'd like to thank the Haitian Studies Association, the African American Intellectual History Society, the Humanities Council, and the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University for supporting this club, which I should mention already had importance, but with current events, I think that importance is only amplified or at least more visible. Because I think it goes without saying that the discussion of slavery, freedom in this book, The Haitians, has to absolutely be connected to the abhorrent, inhumane treatment of Haitians and so many people at the United States border. And so on behalf of my co-conveners, we want to draw attention to these violations. And we also want to think about concrete actions that we can take in solidarity and support. And so I want to bring the attention of everybody in attendance today to an event held by the Haitian Studies Association. Today, they will be holding an emergency session, or not today, this coming Monday. The Haitian Studies Association will be holding an emergency session at 8:00 p.m. So that's Monday, September 27th at 8:00 p.m. If others have links to solidarity groups, resources on legal translation assistance, sponsorship, anything of that nature, please do not hesitate to share in the chat today. Okay. With that, without further ado, I will turn it over to Shelby Sinclair to introduce our guest for today.
Awesome. Thank you, Brendan. So to transition to introducing our speakers, Crystal Eddins is an assistant professor of Africana Studies at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte and holds a dual major PhD in African American and African Studies and Sociology from Michigan State University. She teaches courses on African diaspora theory, slavery, race, and colonialism, and social justice movements. Her research on African diaspora consciousness, historical sociology, social movements, Marronage, and the Haitian Revolution has appeared in the Journal of Haitian Studies, Gender and History, and the Haitian History Journal. She also has contributed writings to public online platforms such as the AAIHS blog, Black Perspectives, and the Age of Revolutions blog, public books, and the Mobilizing Ideas blog. Her work has been supported by the UNC Duke Consortium in Latin American and Caribbean Studies, the University of Florida Center for Latin American Studies, Brown University Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, and John Carter Brown Library, and the National Science Foundation in Sociology Program Doctoral Dissertation Research Improvement Award. Eddins' book, Rituals, Runaways, and the Haitian Revolution, Collective Action in the African Diaspora, is forthcoming with Cambridge University Press. We're all really excited for it. It examines networks between enslaved people, Maroons, and a small number of free people of color built in ritual space and during Marronage that help facilitate the racial solidarity that influenced the Haitian Revolution's success. Jessica Marie Johnson is an assistant professor in the Department of History at the Johns Hopkins University. Johnson is a historian of Atlantic slavery and the Atlantic African diaspora. She is the author of Wicked Flesh, Black Women, Intimacy, and Freedom in the Atlantic World, which came out with University of Pennsylvania Press in August 2020. That text has been lauded far and wide and has won so many awards. She is co-editor with Lauren Tilton and David Wemo of Debates in the Digital Humanities, Computational Humanities. She is guest editor of Slavery and the Machine, a special issue of Archipelago's Journal, and co-editor with Dr. Mark Anthony Neal of Duke University of the text Black Code, a special issue of the Black Scholar. Her work has appeared in Slavery and Abolition, The Black Scholar, Meridians, Feminism, Race, and Transnationalism, American Quarterly, Social Text, the Journal of African American History, the William and Mary Quarterly, Debates in the Digital Humanities, Forum Journal, Bitch Magazine, Black Perspectives, Somatosphere, and Post-Colonial Digital Humanities. Her book chapters have also appeared in multiple edited collections. Thank you both immensely for giving your time today and for being a part of the discussion. We are more than confident that it will be generative and rich, and we're really excited to see how the conversation goes. So I will now turn it over to Chelsea Steeper to get us started.
Thanks so much, Shelby. Thanks so much, Brandon. Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, our sponsors. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We're really, really excited about the second session. So we're going to kick it off. These are great questions. They're questions that involve a lot of discussion, but we also really hope that there'll be questions that bring up discussion for our participants. So everyone, please engage in the conversation with us. So to get started, I've got a question for Crystal. And everyone will note I put her both books links to them in the chat so you can see more. And I'm actually going to just read a blurb from your forthcoming book, not to embarrass you, but to celebrate you and to get a question kind of on the table for you both. So to read a blurb from your forthcoming book, Rituals, Runaways, and the Haitian Revolution. This beautifully crafted and overwhelmingly researched work restores the place of the multitude of known and unknown individuals who deployed myriad cultural, ethnic, and religious practices derived from their African homelands to resist the dehumanization of slavery in 18th century Saint-Domingue, Haiti, in pursuit of racial liberation and human dignity. The book's decolonial perspective makes a seminal contribution to current Black and African diasporic studies. It is historical scholarship at its best. We can all just appreciate that. And again, I share in Shelby's excitement. We are all so excited. So because we don't have the book yet, I want to know more. This blurb resonates with Casimir's argument that, and I'll quote from the Haitians, as soon as they disembarked in colonial Haiti, these African captives began to build a new world at the antipodes of France and the French. And this is from page 5. Can you talk to us about the worlds of the enslaved in colonial Haiti? How do you interpret Casimir's argument that, quote, the response to colonialism was articulated through the development of a new form of sovereignty, one founded on the people's refusal to be vanquished by brute force? That's page 7.
Right. So thank you for that question, Chelsea and Shelby and Brandon, and thank you all again for being here and for inviting me to talk a little bit about the Haitians and my work as well. So the book that is going to be coming out in the next few months is deeply informed by Casimir's arguments, as well as Carolyn Fick's work, who kindly wrote that blurb that you read. So what I do in the book is, I try to kind of extend on, some of the ideas that they've both kind of put forward, but I take Casimir's argument in particular to think about the ways that enslaved people, not only the ways that they express their own humanity, but the ways that they were articulating their conceptions and understandings of how the social world should be organized and governed. And these were ways that were, oppositional to the racialization, the deadly force, and the hyper exploitation that they were experiencing in the colonial context. So the actions that people took and the ways that they developed their own social formations not only demonstrated their resistance to racial slavery and colonialism, but when we look closely enough, we can actually kind of interpret these actions as socio-political critiques of the existing order. So when Casimir talks about the Haitian people's sense of popular sovereignty in the 19th century being grounded in this counter-plantation system of voodoo, of subsistence farming, kin-based land-owning networks, and absconding as a form of labor protest, I kind of extend that backwards, so to speak, and try to unpack, how those types of counter-plantation logics and solidarities and actions existed in enslaved people's social worlds, right? In their sacred practices, their families and extended social networks, the ways that they use their labor skills and their environmental knowledge to survive in maroon spaces, as well as their actions of marronage and other resistance strategies. So I also try to kind of contextualize and foreground these experiences on the African continent, as well as being kind of the source of where these kinds of socio-political critiques and forms of resistance really come into the picture in terms of having this influence on what would later appear in the colonial context. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
So, I mean, to piggyback a little, not to piggyback, to try to go where you're taking us, Crystal, a little bit. It strikes me that when you talk about grappling with the histories of slavery from the perspective of the enslaved, and thinking about how they rejected this, the order of the plantation, the order of slavery, the order of colonialism, wrapped up in all of its, its rationality and its language of civilizing and all of this, right? That it requires a reorienting, and this is a point that Casimir makes as well, that it requires a reorienting of our perspective, of our own perspectives as scholars and just as people, right? And it seems that recently, I'm not sure how recent it is, people have been banging this drum for a while, but maybe more momentum has been gained recently to trying to make that shift in perspective through the very language that we use to write and understand the history of slavery, right? And so I'm thinking about Casimir, of course, where he uses the language very intentionally of captives reduced to slavery, not slaves, right? I'm thinking of Gabrielle Foreman and the work that she did in a very influential crowdsourced guide, for language to use for the enslaved. So I wonder, Crystal, and also Jessica as well, if you could talk just about even about some of the choices you've made in your own work. It could be a specific language, word, or even like conceptually, like decisions you've made to try to really get at the perspectives and present and in some ways translate the perspectives of the enslaved who rejected these logics and these orders.
Yeah, that's a great question as well. I would say that some of the techniques that I use are more so conceptual terms, I would say. I do, employ language around, the enslaved and referring to captives before they have, arrived into the colonial context and become enslaved. But one of the areas where I try to kind of unpack the language around, for example, marronage, is to go back into the etymology and try to think about some of the origins of these words and how we can kind of subvert them. And I believe Robert Schwaller also talks about this in terms of kind of locating the term cimarron and cimarron within the context of the Taino and their linguistic definitions of it in terms of thinking about flight and movement and extrication and extricating oneself from a system. And so I try to use that as a way or as an instructive lens to continue thinking about marronage in that tradition, but also in terms of being kind of a broader political project. And so, I would say that the language around these terms is something that has to be kind of reckoned with and unpacked in a variety of ways, I would say.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you all for having me. It is a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to chat also with Crystal about these things. This is such a good question and such a important question for rethinking how we are organizing the knowledge around how we talk about slavery, as well as how we talk about Africans and their descendants in the Americas. And Chris is absolutely right. Like the ways that we create new conceptual frameworks around what we're doing, what we're describing, also helps reshape how we might be able to open up new ways of thinking about what resistance look like, what are frameworks beyond a kind of European imperial framework or European liberal humanist framework that can get us at what a state is state even the right terminology? So that begins or that continues in so many ways with how we're describing people who were enslaved. So even the use of the word enslaved is obviously a very key one that has been taken up even more broadly. Dr. Foreman and other senior scholars of slavery, the crowdsourced list, I think it was 2018, maybe 2019, but certainly not later than 2019, that is still being used, still cited by journalists and publication sites. And those are just the terms in English, because one of the things I think that has been really interesting are the ways that this discussion has also moved across linguistic, quote unquote barriers. So I think of Miriam Cotillas and Celine Fleury and their editorial in I'm going to forget the title of the journal, but their editorial thinking with terms like les esclavisés, to kind of capture that enslaved framework, like the idea that someone is not a slave, that this is a process that captures them in its grip, and then they are, they are survivors of it, vulnerable to it, et cetera, et cetera. So think of like slavery as a process. And then also thinking, Chris mentioning marronage reminded me that even that term also is in a kind of not contestation, but a kind of reinvigoration in a particular kind of way. So one of the spaces I'm thinking of is the use of cimarrona, cimarron, cimarronex, cimarrone within the context of organizing in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean in particular, but cimarronaje as with the J at the end, as a way of really kind of capturing that same thing, that there is an act here, that this is a verb, that people are doing a thing against slaveholders, against the regime. So those terms are so critical. They're so much a part of the kind of shifting of world building and of thinking about what are the ways we should even think about a place like Haiti, a place like the Caribbean, a place like the place of enslavement, the quarter, the workshop, et cetera. And these are conversations, last thing I'll say is that these are conversations that are important because they're happening beyond the academy. In a lot of ways, the spaces beyond the academy have been the ones to push the kinds of terminology that is used and the ways that we use that terminology. I think in a kind of academic context, because I know that some of this is, I think about this in some of the ways I use the terms myself in my academic work. In the academic context, the kind of granularity that is used as far as whether it's enslaved, bondsperson, trafficked, kidnapped, fugitive, captif, or slave. All of those can also be so dependent on the actual historical context and what you are trying to get at when you're explaining things. Like if you are explaining a level of commodification that requires the word slave, but when we're thinking conceptually beyond that, when we're trying to kind of break some of this knowledge out of its, strange academic silos, being able to use a vocabulary that is, for lack of a better term, the people's vocabulary is really, really critical. And so there's some really important work. And this is also language that is always developing, always in progress.
So the issue of terminology and language, going back to what you said, Crystal, that came to mind. You also said too, the importance that you place on not drawing, whether it be a conceptual or geographic or temporal distinction between an African history and an Atlantic and an American history to understand the overlap and the complexities as these things all intertwine, right? And this is a central point for Casimir, right? He makes the point that to understand the understandings of freedom and the resistance to slavery, that's the Bosalas that Africans and their descendants had in Saint-Domingue really requires a grappling with their origins in Africa, right? And certainly their New World experience, but that Africa matters, to put it simply. And Crystal, this comes through clearly in your work. Jessica, it comes through clearly in your work. So I just wonder if we could talk a bit about that, how you see notions of freedom moving and taking shape around the Atlantic world during the era of the transatlantic slave trade. Put another way, what is Africa? What does Africa mean to the historian of the African diaspora? What should it mean?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think this does connect back to the previous question about language, because, as Casimir points out, and what I also, talk about in the book is that the problems with the way that we talk about some of these groups and the way that we categorize groups of enslaved people, reaches back to these conceptual fallacies that are embedded in the historiography from colonial era thinking, right? So when we, look at the early parts of the slave trade, part of the reason why the so-called African Bosale was preferred over the Creole or the Ladino was because, enslavers assumed that Africans were somehow, uniquely suited to slavery and less inclined to rebel than those who had been exposed to European institutions. And so this idea that the African Bosal was somehow less progressive or backward looking, I think harkens back to this era of colonial era thought, but it also kind of obfuscates just the nature of slavery itself by trying to, identify which group is, somehow has more of a propensity to rebel than the other. Like anyone is going to be more, suited or I guess content with their conditions, right? So what I try to do in the first chapter of my book is to, just kind of go beyond, not even just looking at the continent of Africa as a source of cultural and religious heritage, which, we see the most notably in Haitian Vodou and in Creole, but really also looking at it as a source of socio-political thought and action. So, thinking about people's works like Walter Rodney and Stephanie Smallwood, Toby Green, Sylvain Diouf, Rudolph Ware, and of course, Jessica Johnson. I had to look at, the different regions of coastal Africa that were as places where social transformation and social and political upheaval and revolutions were taking place as a result of the slave trade. And in response to that, the people who are victims or potentially victims of that slave trade are developing, these ideas about the ethics of rulership and the ethics of warfare, the ethics of trade, of slavery and freedom, as well as, these practices of resistance like marronage and other kinds of uprisings that were formulated on the continent. So I would argue that, we should take those aspects of African history seriously when we're looking toward diasporic expressions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's, I came to this understanding of Africans' experience in the Americas, including in Haiti, as out of work that my encounter with it was also through Walter Rodney, also through Michael Gomez, and the scholars who were trying to think about what does it mean to be African in the Americas. What does that actually, like, what does that word actually mean? Who are you? So I come to it from that. I also come to it out of a kind of broader understanding of the important. I think this is also where Casimir is a kind of asking us to return to Bosales and their perspective, their varied and diverse perspective on the world. I also come to it as a way of thinking about what who are we broadly, and what is the work that we're called to do in the world. So thinking about the Institute for the Black World, for instance, that and the Black History arm of that institute, Vincent Harding's work, also Rachel Harding's work, Howard Dotson, other folks who were doing work around what the history, a deep, rich African history has to do with being Black across the Americas. And so just as a framework of doing this topic, wherever you are, whether it's New Orleans, for example, or Brazil, Cuba, or Haiti. You have to look at what happened before, and where people are coming from. That informs the life ways that you see, that you notice, everything from people's names. So when Africanist scholars began pushing scholars of slavery to take seriously African history, one of the things that emerged, and I believe that there's a database of these names connected to the Slave Voyages database. One of the things that emerged was a new interpretation, just simply of names that are found in things like slave ship registers, plantation registers, plantation documents, travel narratives. So names that were taken as, maybe mistakes of the author or narrator, or some kind of gibberish. You can actually they actually have lineages. they have ethnic origins. They have complex origins, and even names that are recognizable have deeper meaning when you understand them in a kind of specified and specific and rigorously researched and deeply researched African context. So the incidence of Islamic names is something, Jew, for instance, as well as Michael Gomez have done research on this. And these are names in Haiti as well as in mainland US, names like Fatima, that were sort of seen as, not necessarily connected to an African context, are Islamic names that are very much connected to potentially a Senegambian context. Like already those kinds of things really deepen our analysis. So that means that where people might imagine there was erasure, maybe there's not. What does it mean to have names that carry over generations? In the context of Haiti, it becomes especially interesting because of, and this is so clear in the book, because of the high number of Africans who have newly arrived, particularly at the time of the revolution. So it's so funny that, because Crystal's right, like the kind of logic of that has been sort of told, the story is told is like, oh, like you want Creole slaves are likely to revolt. And then it turns out that, the Haitian Revolution happens and, the Bosalas are like, well, fuck around and find out, like they are ready to go. And so how do we understand that kind of resistance practice in a context that is not just reactive to empire, but it's also about how people organize their martial lives, what kind of leadership different individuals, communities, and polities are drawn to, how that leadership is organized. Is it organized by spiritual systems? Is it organized by displays of masculinity or femininity, displays of martial power? Like all of these things are informed by, have to be informed by the African context. And the last thing I'll say is that is crucial. All of that would be just crucial information to have, but it is also crucial as a reminder that Africans who are enslaved do not arrive as blank slates in the Americas. So Haiti and other places are being particular places where there is such a high number of slave ships that arrive, and high numbers of Africans who are disembarked and enslaved. That is a particular case, but that also gives us a kind of broader template for thinking about what are the knowledges, the wisdoms, the histories that people come across with. And therefore we can't then approach that history of slavery as though it was, I'll say this, it was terrorizing, but not so terrorizing that people come across as blank slates. And I think that is also something that we have to remember. We should not let empire fool us into thinking that there was nothing to us when we arrived on these shores. Like that would be a very, very false and dangerous misconception. And I think Haiti proves that absolute fact to be false.
Something, Jessica, something that you said and something that Crystal said, and then also Marina Dean Pierre has said something in the chat that brings this important point to what I think is a relevant point to mind. That the places that Africans and people of African descent in the Atlantic world came from were not sites of like hegemonic power, right? That's, and this is a point that you know, I see clearly in your work, Jessica, where you're grappling with women who come from places that there are various states, very, you know, Wolof states that are, you know, making claims to power there, and they're then landing in places that are not in of themselves places that, you know, even when a single empire makes claim to it, they're also oftentimes placed where you know, indigenous polities exert a great deal of power. So I wonder, you know, we it began with a question that, you know, sort of in some ways, you know, asked about a generalized Africa and a generalized Americas. I wonder if we could also talk about how ideas of freedom and practices of freedom of Africans and people of African descent are reshaped vis-a-vis other overlapping diasporas and also inter-imperial competitions. Like, how do those things matter?
Okay, I can try and jump in. You know, I think that for me, when I'm thinking of your question, which is a really excellent one, I told Brandon before we even started that he gave us like dissertation defense type level questions. So I just want to, like, you know, point that out, that Brandon is not here. Nobody here, neither Brandon nor Chelsea are here with the games.
Chelsea's to blame too.
I absolutely no. I threw her name in there. Yeah,
Dare
no, it's your fault.
And we can't let Shelby off. We can't let Shelby off the hook.
So I think about this question a lot because of the ways that my favorite site to talk about the overlapping empires is, of course, the Gulf Coast, is of course New Orleans. But I always try and view this in the context also of the ways that the Caribbean broadly and the island of Hispaniola, AP, is so implicated in a range of imperial formations that happen upon them, upon these places, and that are that emerge and develop as a result of colonialism and slavery. So there is a lot that the structures of empire do and do not do to fracture kinships, to manage freedom. Because I think that, you know, sometimes you can have this conversation and get caught in, you know, like Tannenbaum-ian debates of like, oh, you know, this is a easier slave society. This is, you know, milder, freedom was accessible. We're talking about managing freedom, managing access to it. We're talking about managing slavery, even when and I love that. I love Casimir's framing of this. Even when enslaved people are emancipated, there's not their freedom is not equivalent to the freedom of Europeans. Period. That I think there's a line where he says that they have to essentially sort of trade on their maternal line. They have to trade on their maternal memory in order to be party to the imperial regime, in order to survive. You know, so like, yes, there is this act of survival, but you are trading certain things, and we would be wrong and lax in our learning of how to think through revolution and liberation if we did not actually acknowledge that and think through that as well. So I think that those become really, really critical. What are the structures of power that people are grappling with and against? What are the structures of violence? Who has police power? Who does not? Who has military strength? Who does not? One of the things that is really clear, moving broadly throughout and around the Caribbean and the Circum-Caribbean, even onto South America, is that the fear of and the threat of European arms either re-enslaving Haiti or extending a potential enslavement, re-enslavement to areas around, is also part of that anti-Haitianism that you see that reverberates throughout the Caribbean, which is also anti-Blackness, like the kind of levels of anti-Blackness, anti-Africanness, anti-Haitians, all of these are linked up together. And they're also all about, part of this is also about threat of violence. And so, understanding, who has the arms, the weapons of empire becomes really critical to understanding how people are navigating, how people are able to navigate it. But the other thing I hear in your question, which is where I'll stop, is that is a thing that's really important, in particular to me, and increasingly important in many capacities, is how are we understanding, as an extension of the last question, how are we understanding different African polities as they are engaging in places like that? Learning that and thinking through that is also really critical to, oh gosh, I'm probably talking too fast. Learning that and thinking through that is probably also really critical to how we understand that Bostales framework, that Bostales mindset, that even within that, African arrival knowledge network, that there are also differences in there, and how do we bring those differences into how we're thinking about organizing community kinship, all of that. So that as a piece of thinking about what are the relations in the communities that are involved is really critical, as well as, and this is a piece that I'm trying to do even deeper work on. Particularly, I'm working on my next project, which will have some significant aspects of Puerto Rico involved. Thinking more deeply about the indigenous knowledges and indigenous histories and polities that are also part of the story. And that is about, Taino, Arawak, Dari, like indigenous polities that are already in the region, that are circulating the region. That is about thinking about an archipelagic thinking. So Michelle Stevens and others who have been thinking about what does it mean to connect our knowledges and our communities and our histories by waterways, not by these kind of continental hemispheric frameworks that are literally imperial. And it's also about thinking about that there is a continued engagement, indigenous engagement with the Caribbean, at least from the U.S. mainland side, that even in some ways implicates colonial Saint Domingue. So thinking of the revolt, the Natchez revolt, the indigenous revolt in 1729 in Louisiana, and the end of that revolt, when the French, finally, again, their arms arrived from France, which is how they're able to subdue the Natchez to the extent that they do. Some abscond deeper into the US, but there's a contingent of some 200 that are deported to Saint Domingue. So there's continued, there's all of these relations that are all wrapped up together, and having to really kind of piece those out and have a better understanding of what are the ways of living that we need to recover, or need to return to as information for navigating empire today is really critical. So hopefully that made sense.
Thank you. Crystal, I want to give you either a second to respond if you want to, but also I have some questions on gender that I want to move to as well. So I'll let you lead me where you want to go.
And just briefly, that was a masterful response from Jessica, so I don't know how much more I could really add, but just briefly, I'll just say that, the way that I try to, conceptualize these kind of inter-imperial dynamics is to try to perceive the ways that enslaved people were perceiving, these kinds of conflicts and staking claim to their own sense of power, especially, for example, around the land space and staking claims to certain spaces in the island. For example, there are various places like Plymouth and Piton de Negre, different locations in Haiti that were specifically named because they were maroon strongholds.
I wanna fuck you, motherfucker.
Están prohibidas estas.
What the fuck is that?
Get some people into the waiting room. All right.
So these geographic spaces are named after places that were known to have been Maroon strongholds. And then there are also ways that, Maroons were very active in not just exploiting tensions between the French and the Spanish on the island of Hispaniola, but also in some ways were part of the processes that formalized that border in terms of the ways that these two powers were constantly trying to negotiate how to manage the flow of runaways and fugitives back and forth between these two imperial powers. And so I think that even in the naming of Haiti itself, the naming of different spaces on the island, the concretizing of the border is very much representative of the ways that Black people and Maroons in particular were staking their claim and laying, staking their claim and power to power and to the land itself, even in the midst of all of these kinds of kind of global mechanisms of warfare and contestation.
Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, Jessica. Sorry about the momentary disruption, but we're on it. And I'm glad that we can keep this open. I'm glad that we can keep this dialogic, and we will just whack-moles as necessary. Actually, we have a question from the chat that ties into this question about gender. So I'm going to ask it and sort of bring them together. This is from Marie Nadine Pierre, who has asked a few other great questions in the chat that we will bring up as we go. But I'll start first with the question more broadly about women and about enslavement and slavery. So both of your pieces, and these are the pieces that we sent out for the discussion alongside Casimir, but more broadly in your work, you focus on African women and women of African descent and their practice of freedom in the New World. While Casimir established women as central to the Haitian sovereign existence, and just quoting from the work, they are the pivot and the life bearer, the market woman. They are also far from the main focus of his decolonial reading of Haitian history. How do we understand the Atlantic histories of slavery and freedom better, or perhaps differently, when we center Black women? And so that's the broad question, and then we can move into Marie Nadine Pierre's question from the chat.
I can go, and I'll just and then because then it'll give Crystal the end, and she can jump into this great question. So I'll go more broad because I feel like Crystal will get a little bit more specific. Thinking about African women and women of African descent in the context of decolonizing history as well as the decolonial history means that we are thinking differently about, and this is also how I read, Casimir's work, and also in some ways the next step, as we kind of continue to push deeper into thinking of what a decolonial history looks like and doing it. It means a really kind of pushing against all of the ways that we are forming narrative. It means thinking differently about the kind of sources that we make central for me. So I'll say for me, this is what it is, me statements. It means thinking differently about the kinds of evidence that we privilege. It means which means all of this means thinking differently about the kind of story we tell. So single author narratives, privileging, and thankfully we're well past this. Slave owner diaries, thinking about challenging the gaps in the archive, not just taking for granted that a gap in the archive therefore means that information isn't there. Thinking differently about how we write the story of a place. Are we, telling the story of great men and great empires, or are we telling, as Carolyn Fick set out, in her amazing work, and as others like Crystal are in the tradition of telling history from below. Like, who are we telling history to? It changes audience, and this is why it does that, is because in a lot of ways, to even try and broach a history of African women with African descent, you have to. They don't tend to appear in the archive in the same way. They don't tend to appear in the sources the same way. So if we say your appearance in the source equals your importance to the historical narrative, already African women are going to, drop out of attention there. And yet what we also know is that, as Kissinger points out, African women are very much the fulcrum of life within enslaved communities, within even free communities of color. The free men of color who gain their prominence in Haiti in the period before the revolution, get there because of women who are either having some or subject to some intimate tie with white slave owners who are arriving, or who are themselves, wheeling and dealing, and creating spaces of freedom and accessing admission and self-purchase on their own. So, and you see, this is not uncommon. You see this throughout free communities of color, that if you trace them back, they're often being traced to a woman of African descent. And so what does that mean for the kind of narrative that we're telling about freedom itself, but also what does that mean for who we privilege in even the story of who is the aristocrat, who is the oligarch, who are the Black elite, as far as class and wealth status figures in a given place. Even if you want to tell that particular more traditional story, which is not the story that Casimir is telling, but is the story that some people do like to tell, you still have to think about African women and Black women in their place. And so, like having to reframe our histories and bring African women with African descent into the story already reshapes the kind of narrative we tell. But I think, and this is where I think it's not just bringing them as historical subjects into a kind of more representative narrative, but really taking seriously the kinds of freedoms and community and kinship formations, the radical transgressions of women forming community through, making a way of no way, forming sisterhoods and sororities of contestation together, women defending each other, women creating community together, women creating households together. That forces you to think differently about, okay, what are the communities that we're trying to create? What are the traditions and the practices that we're trying to bring into a decolonial world? And how do we tell that history? Where do we find those stories of confraternities or mutual aid societies that came together in order to not just to purchase someone's freedom, but in order to pool funds for funeral practices? Where do we find those? The women. How do we elevate the women who are the ones who are maintaining the home spaces, the community spaces, the religious spaces, and not just see that work as feminized and therefore not of notice, that center that work is actually the most important work, and what needs to be in place so that most important work has everything it needs to function and to survive. So I think I think those are kind of like the broad reframings that focusing on African women and women of African descent does. It is not just representative in putting women in these kind of figurehead positions, although that can be very important. I don't think that's what Casimir is necessarily interested in here, and having new kind of imperial histories just with Black faces on top. I think what is happening here is how do we rethink the kind of fundamental elements of how society is constructed from the perspective of those who have been most marginalized and most vulnerable, and what do we then need to build around that construction in order to maintain it and support it and have it be resourced.
So this question about women in the archive has been one that personally I've found challenging, but I do agree with the sense that excuse me, I'm sorry, this computer keeps wanting to give me a software update and I'm not ready. I think that Casimir is definitely, centering women in this narrative, albeit not, explicitly, but in terms of the ways that women were prominent in spaces that make up the body of Haitian sovereignty, right? And so this question of how do we find women in the archives? And I agree with the sentiment that women are there, right? They are showing up in archives. And so part of what is important in telling those stories is just to meet them where they are, even if they're not explicitly named, even if they're only very briefly mentioned or not mentioned in very large numbers, but for whatever reason, for different reasons or a variety of ways, they're standing out, right? Women and girls are doing things that make them stand out. And so I think part of the task is to, begin to ask the question of why, what is it that that is happening in the nature of the, immediate context that she's responding to, and why are her actions deviating from what would have been considered the norm for, other women in her position. And I think those kinds of questions kind of help us get a little bit closer to the ways that women were defining themselves and understanding themselves and the world around them. And then that can kind of point into the direction of her intentionality for liberation and freedom more broadly. So when we think about Vodou and the Laku and other ways, other spaces that that women are very much present in, we can see their stamp or their influence in terms of the way we think about things, maybe like right relationship to the land and intimate connections to spirits, connections to family and things like that. And so these questions of relationship and reciprocity, I think, come up when we are interested in looking at the way that women were creating spaces for themselves. And then to the question in the chat around motherhood in marginal spaces and in spaces of captivity in the contemporary United States, I think that, unfortunately, we're living in a time where we see the kind of confluence of so many different crises, especially around care and especially around mothering. For example, there's issues around incarceration and prisons. There have been some activist work here in North Carolina to ban shackling practices around of women who are giving birth while incarcerated. And obviously, with the COVID crisis and the lack of childcare and just healthcare in general and precarity that so many people are experiencing, and that is, constraining people's abilities to not only make autonomous decisions for themselves and for their families, but is, harmful in many ways to our children, and not to mention the fact of, the ways that we see the contestations to mask mandates, to vaccination mandates, and the rise, the increases of COVID rates among children and COVID deaths among children. There's it seems as though there's a particular way in which that racial capitalism kind of expends and makes expendable those who are most vulnerable in society. And that includes women, but that also includes children of those who are already existing in a precarious state because of these existing structural inequalities. And so I don't think I want to go to, well, I think the question of, reproductive justice obviously is where part of this kind of lies in terms of what it looks like for people to be able to live whole lives that are of their own making and of their own decision making, whether they, want to be in family units or not. And so I'll leave it there.
Can I follow up on something I said and it's inspired by there's a question or a comment in the chat that is the newly independent Haiti didn't recognize women's contributions. The 1801 and 1805 constitutions leave us out completely. The Tainas revered women. Our chiefess, Anacaona, there was a great leader and artist who was killed by the Spanish. I question the notion that African traditions recognize the importance of women's contributions as equal. So I think this is really, really important to mention, because I feel like I just want to kind of follow up on the importance of that focus on African women and women of African descent gives us information like this. It shows us the ways that, well, it shows us two things. One, it shows us the ways that our community building, sometimes that's vis-a-vis state building, has not been accountable to everyone within the community. It is not, and that has been it's often fatal flaw in all of our movements, whether that's the movement of enslaved rebels, or whether that is movements in the present day. And so I want to really foreground that if we don't attend to this history, we actually continue to remake these mistakes, where we create structures, states, institutions, governing bodies that are not actually governing everyone, that are continue to replicate imperial formations like patriarchy, as well as heteropatriarchy. So I kind of want to, I wanted to draw attention to that, but I also want to draw attention to something else that attending to African women of African descent is, has to be part of decolonial history, because it also tells us things about what are the imperial formations that are internalized that we also need to continue to address, and that there is a history there. So histories, for example, of intimate violence, histories of within Black communities, within African diaspora communities, histories of homophobia, and of punishing those who don't fit a heteropatriarchal norm. Like all of those things, there are antecedents within the history of slavery, within even the plantation context, within even urban slavery context. The extent to which we are attending to those, I'm thinking about, for example, enslaved like commandeurs, who are often very much lauded as rebels and generals within the Haitian Revolution. The extent to which the commandeur is also often appears within court cases as killing or abusing the enslaved women who he is understood to be in intimate partnership or is in community with. Like, how do we bring those together and hold those in tension? And that's and we can see that in Haiti. I want to make sure that I foreground that as this conversation, but I also want to stress that these are things that are mapped across histories of slavery. And if we can think about how we resolve them for a Haitian context, we actually may be able to again offer a map of something deeper and more inclusive is probably not the right word. I think I want to use like self-governing, but everybody as party to governing together. Other kinds of state formations, which is also what I understand from this important book, is that there are other ways of doing of forming the state, forming community, and forming together that are not that don't have to be imperial.
Thank you both so much. That is well, first of all, it's a great plug for the next session, which is about sovereignty in the state. And all of it kind of comes around, and yet we go cyclically a bit as we do in a spiralist way, which is a plug for the first session where we talked about spiralism. So it's all here, but truly, and especially bringing it to the present, because there's so much that does continue, right? There, the sort of parallel, or if not, there's a discussion, especially in the end of the book, about the interactions, right? It's not a completely unporous relationship between the Haitians and the state, but but sort of the parallel structures that form over the course of the 19th century. And so I'm actually going to just share my screen. I had asked you both when we sent some questions ahead of time to consider this long passage that I think is really rich and that we can maybe work off of as we move toward the end and open it more to conversation. Hopefully this will give people some something to grab onto as well if they're not yet familiar with the book. So I'm going to share my screen, which I'm trying to talk and do at the same time, and I can't find it. Here it is. All right. So here is this long passage, and I feel a bit strange to read it, but I'm going to read it. So here we are. When I change my perspective, I can see how from 1697 to 1804, the population had no way of reproducing itself. It increased only through the acquisition, year after year, of unfortunates kidnapped from Africa through the most villainous means. The slave trade, these words contain so many crimes. How many horrors and abominations can be found in this simple expression? That's from Baron de Batte's The Colonial System Unveiled. These deportees were incorporated against their will into colonial life. They lived in conditions that until then had never been experienced by human beings in a territory that modern colonialism is unashamed to celebrate as the richest possession in the world. Then, from 1804 to 1915, this same population that the West wishes to see as made up of former slaves rather than former captives, multiplied fourfold through its own means. They attained a standard of living that was previously unknown to them, and better than that of the neighboring territories that were still possessed and governed by this same modern, civilized West. It is worth noting that we are talking about a Western civilization whose populations were, during the same 19th century, fleeing their life conditions en masse to establish themselves on new shores. I feel called to recognize the power of this mass of descendants of deportees and to observe how, on their own, they were able to move beyond the conditions of captivity and successfully establish themselves in a land and in conditions not of their own choosing. In place of a population distributed by France to various concentration camps along the plains and hills of the country, and an economic life carried out to the rhythm of cracking whips and the unstable needs of the metropolitan market, I contemplate the flourishing of garden villages everywhere in Haiti, and a daily life cadenced by the calendar of rural markets that functioned to fulfill the needs of the consumers and the market women who circulated between them. I contemplate the beauty of the incontestable victory of the sovereign people. And I'll leave that up here. Maybe I can make it smaller so that we can squint and see it. But I'll leave that here. There's so much. I mean, in a sense, we're going cyclically. We're sort of recapturing everything that you guys have talked about so poignantly. But I wanted to think more specifically, and then maybe we can build out again, and then bring in this audience, about not just reproductive justice, but these kinship practices, these ways of organizing life that Jessica was referring to before in Maroon communities that you've studied, in this pre-19th century period, and what you see as this central way of life that continues on into the 19th century, or possibly does, right? I know we all have to stop at a certain point with our areas of focus. Or maybe, and this is a much broader question, but one that could answer or ask it otherwise, what does this woman-centered history of resistance and freedom making during slavery tell us about the history of post-independence Haiti, and possibly, as Jessica has alluded to, the post-slavery Americas? Huge question. Take off whatever bits you want to start.
I can go ahead. So when I think about that passage, I really, and the way that he frames, the way that Casimir frames the role of reproduction in generating the Haitian people and the sense of Haitian sovereignty, I think it's important to remember that what he says, from 1697 to 1804, the population had no way of reproducing itself. That lack of reproduction is premised on death, right? It's premised on, the mass deaths of enslaved captives that are brought to the colony and are being killed almost indiscriminately through violence, through brutality, through overwork, through starvation. And those mass deaths are even, if we want to take it back, are even kind of predicated on the mass genocides of, the indigenous population of the Taino. And so I think part of what becomes, a major factor that enslaved people and Maroons are contending with is the question of death, how to protect themselves from death, how to mediate death, and in some cases, how to inflict death. So for example, thinking about like the poison campaigns that were organized in the North by Francois Mackandal, and some of the kind of language that came about through that case was really not only about it wasn't just about the deaths of, inflicting the deaths of white people, but also about, inflicting deaths in some cases on other enslaved people, on animals. And so there were, I think, a variety of ways that death became prominent in that space. Burial rites became a prominent, or were noted as being kind of prominent spaces where, enslaved people and Maroons could come together around sacred practices, again, to come to common understandings of their social conditions. And I also think of the ways that death continues to kind of figure within the symbology of Haitian Vodou, around the Gede and the ideas that, the Gede, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it, but the Guerevi peoples were, the indigenous inhabitants of the Dahomey Kingdom, and potentially were, among the first deportees that were enslaved, captured and enslaved and traded to Haiti through Dahomey. And so the fact that the Gede rite in Vodou represents and symbolizes death and the life cycle, I think is also something that can be kind of traced back to that origin. But to get back to your question about the enslaved population and the Maroons, about Maroon spaces and what people are doing in them. So I'm definitely kind of drawing on the ideas that these Maroon spaces were, cultivating the practices and behaviors and actions that we see in what, Casimir calls this the counter plantation system. And so in that regard, and I'm thinking I thought that my impression was that this question was particularly about women. Women are showing up in all of these spaces. They're disproportionately represented among the plantation work gangs. They're also, cultivators in Maroon spaces as well as during the Haitian War of Independence. They're central figures in some of these burial rites, as well as in the sacred rituals that bring together or eventually coalesce into Vodou. So for example, the Boakeman ceremony, we know that Cecile Fatiman was this Mambo who was co-presiding or leading and presiding over this particular ritual ceremony that took place in the days just before the Northern Insurrection in 1791. And there were other women who were kind of mentioned in a similar vein in terms of women of Vodou practitioners who were providing sacred rituals to the rebels and providing them protection and not divulging their names and keeping secrets. And so thinking about those connections between gender and religion and how and the roles that they were playing in these revolutionary processes. And in other ways, women they were seamstresses, they were hairdressers, midwives, market women. So they're taking advantage of their skill set, as well as the latitude that they may have had through their quotidian practices or their daily routine to escape. And they're doing so with men, with other women, with children, and are being a part of the wider body of conspiracies and plots and resistance, and indeed being tortured and being subject to violence and even execution as punishment for those actions. And so when we think about, I think that when we think about the ways that women show up in these spaces, they're not there, right? They're in every space. And I think that the part of what I tried to do in my book and what I see Casimir doing in the Haitians is kind of unveiling the ways that women, as well as just Maroons in general, were trying to organize new ways of life, even in the midst of the plantation economy.
Yes, absolutely. I feel like that was such a phenomenal answer. Even just the rundown of places and spaces. Yeah, it just tells you, women and girls, they're there, and so yeah, I'm trying to think of what I could possibly add. I guess if I was thinking more broadly of the question, that I would think about the ways that a woman-centered history of resistance and freedom during slavery tells us that women are always there, are also there, that people have life ways, that they are, not just a kind of, yastaan, able-bodied adults, that there are arcs of lives and there are generations. And so how do we think intergenerationally? How do we think of how in our making of a post-independence, post-slavery, post-imperial world, are we thinking intergenerationally? What are we building so that people at all points of their life are have what they need? And where is the history for that? Where is the history for children? And thinking about, for me, I'm very interested in Black girlhood, but broadly childhood. Where have children been most vulnerable and harmed? And so, where might they be safe? So we understand the history of where they've been harmed. Can we reknit spaces in the present where they are now safe? Where it also tells me that histories, that the empire is built. I strongly believe, and other people can disagree. I strongly believe that empire is built very much on intimate violence, very much on histories of rape, and configurings of relation, intimate relation as a power dynamic and as about domination and as a violence, and a woman-centered history of slavery and freedom shows us that. I mean, it's right there it's right there from Partus Nequit. It shows us that is the state of things, and it should force us in understanding that as a state of things. Think about, all right, well, how do we remap that? How do we remake that? We should be confronted by that, and that again is not just European to African, white to Black. That is also ways that is internal and has been internalized and has been reproduced within our own community. So how do we learn from a past in which that has been the case, and learn from women and girls, in particular, resistance to that, although we know that rape is not limited to any gender. How do we learn from resistance to that? How do we learn for ways that measures that have been taken in the past to create safety? How do we implement that in the present? So I think there's so much there that a history centered in those ways can really offer a lot to the present. And I just want to shout out Regina Jean-Charles' amazing work on intimate violence in Haitian literature, but also in present day work around really working and addressing intimate violence within Haitian communities and the Haitian diaspora.
We could keep going. We should keep going, but not unfortunately, happily, I see a number of folks getting into the conversation, and so now we want to open this up to your comments, questions, just anything on your mind. You can put it in the chat. You can raise your hand. We already got one. Good brother Jesus Ruiz. We'll go ahead and jump to you then.
There we go. Can you hear me? Well, thank you, Chelsea. Thank you, Brandon. And thank you, Dr. Eddins, Dr. Johnson. Just continuing to learn so much. So I have kind of a two-part question, and it's something that I've been thinking about a lot, not only in light of course, Casimir's book and both of your works, but in light of as we started the meeting, of the current situation at the border. So we talk so much, or so much of what we study, of what we do, is about the destruction of Black bodies. One of the things that I find really salient in both of your works, in conversation with Casimir, is actually deeper than just a sort of a simplistic understanding of resistance, but actually about creation. And it's something that I've been thinking about a lot in today's conversation, whether it's new conceptions of freedom or kinship ties, as both of your works masterfully show, whether it's spaces of sustenance, as Casimir teaches us, or literally new life, right? This idea that creating something new is something that I'm just sort of thinking about a lot. And so I think I wanted to pose that as a way of seeing if either of you could maybe speak to that. And I don't know if that makes any sense, but maybe the second part of the question will help. And so the second part of the question is sort of what that in turn has me thinking about and this might be, full disclosure, this might be kind of self-serving, because this is something that I grapple with in my own work in Española, in San Domingo, and Santo Domingo, and in the borderlands, but is how the question about the ways that borders and landscapes are being threatened through the bodies of the women that both of you are studying, right? Through bodies, through spaces. And so this has me thinking about Gilroy. It has me thinking about Césaire, Jennifer Morgan, even Taki's or Vincent Brown's work, like how he sees. Obviously, his framing is different in the sense of warfare, but how he's seeing literal bodies as the landscape, as creating that landscape. And so, anyways, that's sort of the second part. Is just I want to get a sense as to how both of you are thinking about bodies as borders or imperial borders, right? Or spaces that are actually being construed through bodies, if that makes sense. So sorry if that was incoherent, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll try to tackle the first question about resistance and creation. And thank you for those questions, Jesus. I think part of what Casimir mentions and describes, and part of what I also kind of intimate in some of my work, is that I think there's a way in which these practices of resistance are what creates the space for the creation to proliferate. Right? And that's not to say that there aren't other ways that enslaved people or Maroons or people in general can, cultivate their own practices, within apparatuses that are oppressing them. But for the kind of, freedom making, and actual new life ways that point to the absence of that oppression, that point to the absence of slavery and colonialism. There's a requirement of either opting out from the system through marronage or fighting against it in the form of, the Haitian Revolution and, create, overturning these systems and creating a new state and a new space for creation to grow and be reproduced. So I definitely can see, I definitely do think that there is an important distinction to be made when we talk about these terms like resistance and freedom and fugitivity and marronage, and thinking about how they're ordered in the ways that human beings create these processes of making new cultures and new structures and new institutions. And I really appreciate the way that Casimir kind of describes that process in ways that are deeply that are in some ways like deeply sociological, but also very careful in terms of outlining how people's interactions in various spaces lead to new types of creations and new patterns and new habits and new ways of thinking and conceptualizing life and society. And so I think that, I think that a lot of that is predicated on this kind of ongoing connection between this ongoing interrelationship between resistance and social change and the creation of what's new and the ways that people then adapt to those new conditions.
I wanted to actually jump in here, if it's okay. I was thinking a little bit back to a comment not unrelated to what we're discussing here in Jesus's important question about, bodies, thinking about borders and landscapes and how they're being threatened through the bodies of women, right? Earlier, just want to shed a little bit of light on this. Lois Wilkin mentioned that, women are prominent voices in voodoo singing. And Lois remarks that it seems likely that they preserved and created the song repertoire and much of it in langage, phrases in Fongbe, Kinkongo, and other languages from Africa. I thought that was really important, especially as we're thinking about gender, as we're thinking about bodies, policing, landscapes and borders, and sort of the geographies and what ways women are constructing alternative geographies in order to bring to life some of the resistance practices that we're discussing today. So Lois, I want to say thank you for that addition.
Absolutely. I think that when we are, and I don't want to, hog up the question, so Jessica, feel free to jump in. But one of the areas I think where these borders and landscapes and the ways that imperial power is being imposed on women is through reproduction and these kind of involuntary connections and relationships that women are being forced to endure. And so one of the things that I kind of highlight in the book is talking about the ways that women and children were racialized in different ways depending on their origin of birth or the location of their birth. Depending on their skin tone or phenotype, depending on who may have fathered the child. And so, and this kind of goes back to the question about language. When an African woman, for example, gave birth to a child on the lands in the colony, then that child becomes a Creole, right? So there's automatically this kind of artificial difference being created between mother and child, or if a a woman was assaulted by a white man, and that child becomes referred to as a mulatto, or a mixed race person. Again, there's this, even that in and of itself is kind of evidence of the violence that women were experiencing. And we can kind of add that to even the other forms or other ways that women and other enslaved people in general were experiencing violence to their bodies, such as the branding and even injuries that they were incurring due to dangerous, labor practices on plantations and during the, processes of cultivating sugar and coffee and these agricultural crops that were the bedrock of the colonial economy. And so all of these things, I think, in terms of reproduction and in terms of labor, ability, physical ability, are very much kind of socially constructed and a product of that imperial violence.
Jesus, thank you for your question. Shelby, thank you and Lois, thank you guys for all of these. I feel like Crystal gave an amazing rundown. I guess the only kind of pieces that I might take up here and thinking about, and I guess this sort of goes along with that same theme of like, what does looking at women and gender, and particularly in gender and state formation, give us? The ways that it makes us ask questions about property and about the property dynamic. And I think this is going to get me to bodies, and I'm hoping that this gets me to bodies. But to add on to what Crystal just laid out as far as mechanisms for resistance, as well as the different range of violences that are enacted, and their communal nature, that an act of violence, an intimate act of violence, is not just on that person, that woman, that girl, it's also a community act, it's an act of terror. And so there's something there that's really important. It also is the other side of that, terrible coin, is that the kinds of structures, just even thinking of just legal and economic structures that emerge out of slaveholding, that are then reconstituted in different ways in various constitutions and in laws that stigmatize women for not being married, or privilege those who are, those kinds of things that are operationalized in post-slavery societies, that those are about a property dynamic that is about divesting, at their core, they're about divesting Africans of the gains of their labor, of their property, of their financial legacies. And if we wanted to keep it to like that kind of bare bones materialist, about the role of women, the impact of these worlds on women, and the ways that that history is really, really central to the kind of statecraft that we engage in. So the protection of property, the sequestering it in the hands of slave owners, which also sequesters it in the hands of, in this case, France, which sequesters it in the hands of a particular kind of elite that are engaging in their own statecraft, and ancien regime France. Like, all of this is on purpose, and all of it is happening through part of second adventure, and for those who are enslaved, and primogeniture for those who are not. And so all of these are just like, this is just barely scratches the surface of what we learn and what we engage in, which I think is going to get me to bodies. Like, I think there's something, Taki's Revolt is such a phenomenal book. And I feel like there's a way that and the question about it is such a great question, because I think there's ways that we can get esoteric sometimes, or arcane, with how we talk about slavery, the slave owner, the slaveholding system, the slave, the enslaved, because sometimes just changing the terminology doesn't actually change the vocabulary framework of how we're doing things. Hang on. So I think that there's something really important to what Vince posits. And if I remember, one of his first places of positing this was in the social and political life of the enslaved essay that he does as a kind of taking up of Orlando Patterson's slavery and social death framework, which is often taken up in ways that I go well beyond what Patterson was mandating in his text, which is a particularly sociological text. That about this thing that applies across all slaveholding societies, or the category of the slave as the sociological category that we can then fit into other kinds of schema. The free person of color, the freed person. We are actually talking about people, right? Like, we're talking about people who are actually living the experience of having been enslaved. And that's never a kind of sole unitary experience. It's never an all-encompassing experience. It's the experience of seeing people, even if you do not secure freedom, seeing other people secure their freedom, hearing rumors of revolts, thinking of Julia Scott and His Common Wind, seeing of having children and all the different complicated ways that is an experience for those who are reproducing, of losing family members. Like, those are actual, real, concrete experiences that people who are occupying, who populate these Haiti have. And so how is the history, the work that we're creating, the research that we're doing, reflective of the actual lived experience, the quotidian experience, the intimate experience? And of course, for me, looking at women, it forces us to go there in ways that we might not have. But it also forces us to do, in some ways, the opposite, which is that it also forces us to see that there is a fiction of what mastery is and a fiction of what empire is, that the actual lived experience of people of African descent, of Africans, shows us. So if we actually attend to that quotidian, the intimate, and the body, there is, that shows us what the lie of mastery actually is as it's laid out.
Yeah, I think what I love about that is that it really ties into beautifully some of the themes that you all started with earlier today, thinking about the importance of ontology here, and why, language and how we talk about these ideas really helps us to construct and shape how we write the histories, how we think about them, and how we understand people in real human bodies in real time today. It's very, very interesting. We have a couple of other comments also in the chat related to other connections with women and debates on tetanus. It looks like Deborah Jensen had something to add here. Deborah, if you wanted to jump in, we definitely welcome your comment. Can she hear?
Hey, sorry about that. Yeah, it's really sort of interesting to consider the degree to which, outside of debates about women's freedom with their own bodies, there was a kind of consciousness of reproduction as a kind of playing into property rights, and Guinea serving as a space of transition and passage away from the designated arrival of infants as a part of slave owners' property. And I mean, I know that for someone like Dessalines, he certainly, consistently refers to women in terms of those who are holding infants on their breast. And, I guess there's a question where we're sort of accustomed to considering that around discourses of sentimentality and, maternal roles, but there is also this question of property that reads quite differently from questions of prostitution, for example, in Western capitalist societies.
Certainly. I think in the same vein, I wanted to add in a comment that we just got from YouTube that maybe we can use to help frame some of the final remarks and maybe comments from our lovely guests. Marian Adderley wrote, Casimir shows radically one way to write differently, decolonially. And I think what Marian is taking up here is some of the earlier remarks connected to what Deborah just mentioned, but what might it look like to think through Haiti and to write about Haiti without the omnipresence of patriarchy, right? I think that gets at a lot of what we've discussed today, but also carefully tucks in some of Deborah's remarks and comments as well. So Dr. Eddins or Dr. Johnson, if you want to think about that. It's a big question, right? What would it look like to write about Haiti, to think through and with and alongside Haiti without the omnipresence of patriarchy?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And to me, I feel that, when Casimir talks about, writing in this decolonial fashion and in decolonializing sociology and kind of moving beyond archives, part of what he's doing, I think, is using, what some of us would refer to as like a sociological imagination, of using what we know and, like Jessica was saying, kind of extrapolating that into the actual lived realities of what people were experiencing. What was the aftermath of violence? What were the ways that enslaved women were experiencing the effects of racial capitalism, like on their bodies and the exploitation of their bodies to perpetuate that system. And I think about how, Casimir in some ways kind of eschews the archive in order to be able to do that work in a way that represents the truth of who Haitian people are from the perspective of the sovereign. And so for me, it almost feels like a way of thinking about it and thinking through Haiti in the absence of patriarchy might be doing so in the absence of archives as they're traditionally or currently conceptualized and utilized, and looking to other sources, other bodies of knowledge, other pools of knowledge, and other sources and other places for historical knowledge. Looking to Vodou, for example, as a repository of collective memory and historical knowledge, looking to family practices and practices among women in these markets and in the spaces where they are, and tapping into the kinds of knowledge that they have that kind of transcends what we consider valid knowledge in the form of the written word. So those are some kind of, I guess, like preliminary or sketches of thoughts I have around how we break through the archival silences. It might be to kind of set aside the archive for other methodologies. And in addition to doing that, prioritizing and uplifting the spaces where women are, as well as the ways that they are in the world, and how that is, and thinking about how that is historically constituted, and being able to, tell those other types of stories.
Deborah, were you going to jump in there? Did you have
Sure. Yeah, I really like what Crystal is saying there. And you know, one interesting place to look is at recent anthropological revisiting of the history of patriarchy, where some scholars have been surmising that it really is not so much a part of hunter-gatherer very early societies, but rather of agricultural property accumulation. And, you know, nobody wants to make sort of, you know, broad arguments that could easily be thrown out of kilter with regard to structures of slave cultures in Africa or elsewhere. And yet it does seem as though there's something to be said for Jean Casimir's comment about reading everything through the logic and the norms of social life in Saint-Domingue and in independent Haiti that can bring us back to you know, polygamy, different kinds of non-marital interrelationships, and the possibility that there are a lot of social structures that are falling through the cracks of patriarchal transcription and historiographical recording of that society rather than the society per se.
Yes, I mean, I think that there's so much that thank you, Crystal and Deborah and Marion, I believe from YouTube. I think that's the project. I'll put it like that. I love it. I do love it, but I think that's the project. Doing histories. What is history after patriarchy? What is history after empire? But also, what are the worlds that we're like trying to make today, and what is the history that will help us do that? And I think sometimes we can be shy about history that is utilitarian in that way. And I think that we need not be, because I think one of the things, and I think the Haitians shows us this, the text as well as the Haitians themselves shows us this, is that the very construction of history is also for a purpose. That it was for a purpose of telling a story about empire, and these are tools that, you know, as we know, and I'm thinking of Chelsea and Brandon's work in particular. The tool of history was very much taken up both by Haitians as well as Black people across the diaspora in their, for better or for worse, in their minds, in service of Haiti, to tell the story of Haiti, and that story has always been. History has always been utilitarian in that way, and meant to attempts to do that work. And so, so for me, is to inform historical practice that can reshape the world. I also think that if we, I also think there's something too, like, okay, looking around right now, what is the history that we need in order to change things? And I want to be less shy about that. I want us to be less shy about that. And I think that history is a history after patriarchy. It's a history in which sex workers and sex work is not stigmatized. It's exactly as Deborah, as you're saying, it's a history in which other social formations are not seen as other, or as pathological, or as savage, whatever these terms that that, you know, European Enlightenment, you know, anti-African, anti-Black formations have offered, anti-Indigenous formations have offered us. So I think that that's sort of what we're looking at, and I think we're on our way, and have well been on our way. So we just have to keep pushing.
Amazing. I think that's exactly right. Oh, Brandon, were you? Okay,
You got it.
that's exactly right. It is the work. I'm so excited about the scholarship that is being done now and about both of your work, Dr. Eddins and Dr. Johnson. I think that's actually a perfect place for us to wrap up for today. I am so encouraged by today's conversation and really enjoyed all of the audience insights and our YouTube engagement. And so thank you all for being here. And a huge thank you to Professor Johnson, Professor Eddins, and to our lovely interpreters, Nadej and Nadine, for their hard work today. I do want to put in a plug for our next session. We will meet on October 15th to discuss sovereignty in the state with Chelsea Kivland and Natalie Pierre. Same time, same place, the same link, same registration link will let you into our conversation for next time. And we hope that you all will join us. So thanks again for coming to the Haitians Book Club, and we hope everyone has a lovely weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to all.